This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Herbin Lie de Thé. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare Herbin Lie de Thé to inks from my collection that are similar. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. I don't think Herbin Lie de Thé would be very enjoyable to write with using a glass dip pen. When I was writing with it, it came off the nib pretty quickly at the beginning and then started writing dry pretty quickly. The swatch that I made with tweezers on this Tomoe River paper is nice and crisp, but on other papers I had trouble getting the ink to grab onto the paper. There's a nice range of dark to light, which may translate into some nice shading. And the dark drip at the end of the swatch has a little halo of even darker ink, but no sheen. Because of this ink's unusual behavior with the dip nib and the tweezers, I decided to test more pens than normal, and I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This nib makes an even finer line than normal, I feel like, and I think that's probably because this ink has trouble grabbing onto the paper, like I mentioned up here when I was talking about the tweezer ink swatch that I do. And it does feel pretty dry, so that's what I'm going to put. It just feels dry. And sometimes it can feel dry and be tolerable, but I'm going to go ahead and put a little sad face there to remind me that this isn't the most enjoyable writing experience. Next, I've got my new Pilot Lucina. It has a fine gold-plated steel nib. This is much smoother, and you can see it's putting down quite a bit more ink than the extra fine steel nib. It's not making that much wider of a line. It doesn't look like the line width is that much wider, but there's enough more ink being put down that the line's a little bit darker, it's more legible, and it feels much smoother than the extra fine. Next, I've got a Caveco Al Sport. It has a 14 karat fine nib. You can see that this German fine nib is quite a bit broader than the Japanese fine nib, and it's not putting down that much more ink. You can tell when you're writing that the nib just feels wider, the way it feels on the paper. It's smooth, like the Pilot, like the Pilot nib, but it's a different kind of smoothness, just because you can feel that it's a broader contact on the page. Next, I've got a Pilot E95S. It also has a 14 karat fine nib. Just like the previous three fine nibs, it's nice and smooth. The line width of this E95S is closer to the line width of the Quebeco fine nib, and I've heard that E95S's run a little bit broader than the other Pilot nibs. Next, I've got a Sailor 1911 Standard. It has a 14 karat medium hard nib. This Sailor nib has more feedback than the previous three, but on this smooth Tomoe River paper, it's very pleasant. So I'm going to put, it has feedback, but it's nice. If you like to hear the nib on the paper, the little scritchy, scratchy sound, this is a good choice. And it looks good with this ivory pen and gold hardware. Next, I've got a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat medium nib. My Grants has more feedback than normal with this ink, but it's still nice and pleasant. I was anticipating it being a little wetter than the Sailor 1911, but it looks like they're putting down roughly the same amount of ink. Maybe the Pilot is putting down even less ink, but it just looks wetter the way the ink is going down on the page. It looks like there's more ink there. I like the way the Sailor looks, the way the writing looks. I find on some of the papers, the Pilot Grants just looks a little sloppy, like it's too wet. But maybe if you have a larger handwriting and you're writing bigger, that would compensate for that extra ink. Next, I've got a Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel cursive medium. Not bad. Sometimes this nib feels like it's not putting down enough ink, but it's putting down a decent amount of ink, and it felt nice and smooth. It looks a little drier than, say, the Pilot Grants because it's spreading that ink out over a wider line. I'm going to put that this one was smooth. Next, I've got a Caveco Lilliput. It has a double broad gold-plated steel nib. This is writing a bit drier than normal. Usually this is a pretty wet nib, and I don't know, it just feels like I'm wanting more ink on the page. But it did feel nice and smooth. And finally, I've got a Ginhowe X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel nib. Nice and smooth, and it's putting down a good amount of ink, and it looks like there's going to be some nice shading with this nib. While that dries, I'll take a look at the other writing samples. The writing sample that I did on copy paper, as I was writing, I could tell that the ink was looking grainy. Let me get a little closer so that maybe you can see. And the edges of the letters look a little ragged. It looks like most of these felt pretty dry, with the exception of the Grants that just felt a little too wet, but it was okay to write with. The Caveco double broad was nice and smooth, but again, it just felt like there wasn't enough ink going down on the page. You can kind of see there the X was a little bit dry. I guess my favorites on this paper were the Caveco and the Lucina, the Caveco fine nib. They felt smooth, but at the same time they felt a little dry. Honestly, this ink is, to me, just not well suited for this kind of paper. This ink has some interesting character to it with the shading, and that's what it's kind of known for. And on this paper, you're just not getting that. And I've mentioned in the past that my new copy paper that I'm using isn't 20 pound, it's more like 24 pound, and not many of the inks bleed through it, but this ink did come through quite a bit more than most other inks. So this isn't one of my favorites to use on copy paper. Rhodia is always the first writing sample that I do, and I was a little disappointed because everything felt so dry. Some of them felt dry, but they were nice enough to use. But one of the things to notice with the Pilot Grants, it was putting down quite a bit of ink, but you're not seeing any shading. It's just a flat brown ink. And after I did each of these writing samples, and the best that I got was the Grants that was just a really wet writer, and you didn't get any character, or the Caveco 14 karat fine nib that was just okay. I got my E95S out, and it felt drier than normal, but I have to say I kind of liked it. And you see, my lighting's not real good right now, but with the E95S, you see a little more of the character of the ink. In my Leuchtturm bullet journal, the writing sample that I did with the 1.5 stub nib just has really nice subtle shading. It's a really pretty ink on this paper. Next, I've got my Kokyo Jibun Techo. I'm using old pages from this year's planner to do writing samples, and I usually do writing samples on a larger variety of paper than I show on the video, but I'm going to go ahead and show these because I got such different results with each of the papers. On my Jibun Techo, this is nice smooth paper similar to the Tomoe River paper that's in my Hobonichi, and everything was just nice and pleasant until I got down to the Pilot 78G. It was just a little too dry. Herbin Lie de Thé on this Tsubame ink collection card comes across as pretty flat, so I pulled out my KWZ Honey, which can range from a nice brown to a golden color, and they're similar when you look at the writing, but I didn't do my writing samples on this one. This one is going to be more yellow in your broader nibs. I went ahead and pulled Monteverde Moonstone. It's more of a gray brown, but these two are similar in that they're both a flat ink. There's no sheen to them. I pulled Noodler's Rome Burning. These two aren't really that similar, and Noodler's Rome Burning is more of a wetter ink, and I pretty much use it exclusively in my extra fine nib. It's just too wet for anything broader than that for me. But something about these two reminded me of each other. I pulled out my Caveco Caramel Brown, which is more of a reddish brown and also has a bit of sheen. And finally, I pulled Ackerman SBRE Brown, and it's quite a bit different. It's more of an orangey brown, and it also has sheen. Herbin Lie de Thé has a water-resistant component. It looks like it has a gray component that sticks around nicely, and even in the extra fine, you're able to read what was left behind very easily. Okay, on the 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, we didn't have anything that even came close to bleeding through the page. This Tomoe River paper and the Kokyo paper, with it being nice and smooth, were pretty pleasant to write with. I was concerned about the Pilot Metropolitan because it's such a dry writer, and with this ink having trouble sometimes grabbing the page, I was worried about it being unpleasant, but it wasn't bad on this smooth paper. After my initial writing experience on the Rhodia paper with it being so dry, I was kind of worried about this ink, but if you try it on different papers and try it with a few nibs, it's a little bit finicky, but there's a decent number of pens and papers that this works with that I think is going to make this an enjoyable ink. I think my overall favorite was the Pilot E95S. That's a pretty wet writer, and wet inks I tend to not like in that pen because it's just so sloppy, and this makes a nice crisp line that I like the looks of it. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.